Hello and welcome back to this damn Fatalistic Crusade. This video will be a continuation of my Batman the Animated Series coverage, and since the show is just turning 30 this year, I decided I was going to make a really difficult choice and try and do my own personal top favorite episodes. I originally tried to do a complete ranking of the entire series, but since there really are no bad episodes. It is an almost impossible task. In fact, trying to rank all of the Batman the Animated Series episodes in order of preference is literally one of the most difficult rankings I've ever tried. So I decided to just cut it down to my personal top 20 episodes to try and make a more manageable video in terms of length. And, I'll talk about each episode in a little bit of detail, but this is just where I am at this point in time. And if you were to ask me, say, I don't know, 5 minutes from now or tomorrow, it would probably be a completely different list of answers because you really just have to go by personal preference because Batman the Animated Series is such a wealth of not just excellent creativity, but absolutely brilliant writing and reconstituting the entirety of the Bat mythos into a new realm while pulling from not just the light, but also the dark and blending them together perfectly with just the right amount of humor and nuance to create a fully three-dimensionalized version of Batman, which still remains pretty much the definitive adaptation of the Dark Knight detective. So as you can see behind me, and if you've seen my other videos on the series, I'm of course a gigantic fan of Batman the Animated Series, the entire creative team and personnel behind the show that reinvigorated Batman for an entire generation, and of course the entirety of the rest of the DC animated universe that was to come. So trying to simply get it down to my personal 20 top favorite episodes was an almost impossible challenge. So I did this by merely focusing entirely on the original two runs of episodes. So this is just my top 20 episodes of Batman the Animated Series, and it does not include any of the new Batman adventures, which is sort of the sister show. It is a little bit different, not just the animation style, the tone's a little bit different. So I've always considered that a sort of sister show because it was produced in tandem with Superman the Animated Series. So while it does have a lot of the same team, it is a little bit different. So I kept this strictly to Batman the Animated Series and Adventures of Batman and Robin episodes. That did make it a little bit easier to get it down to just 20, but this is still just 20 episodes out of the original two-season run, if you will, and even that is a Herculean task because again, the writing on this show is so absolutely brilliant that again, there really are no bad episodes. There are some episodes that people don't like or they like to poke fun at or kind of get on their nerves a little bit for different reasons, and then there's some goofier episodes, but still there's always great moments throughout them and they never lose the consistency of tone that the series is so well known for. And personally, I love those episodes as well because they give you, again, a greater sense of the world, and you need some of those later episodes. Plus, the series is so full of allusions to other things that the animation team was a great fan of, or things they wanted to put in there, or various references they made. So if you're a fan of some of these things, you will notice little Easter eggs and nods. Of course, you can't go without being a Bond fan. You can't not see all of the many James Bond references that are both story but also visual references to the Bond series. Whether it's Batman climbing on a plane in mid-flight, a la Octopussy's climax, they're all over the place. But it's fun even seeing things like that in some of the ostensibly more silly episodes. And again, I love every episode. I could make the case for every episode. The only one that gives me pause is perhaps is Critters from the new Batman Adventures. I'll go ahead and say it. That's the one episode everybody likes to complain about. But that one, it just goes into pure 50s giant monster territory. And it's fun for what it is. And they needed to do something to recharge the batteries a little bit. But that was always the one that gave me a little bit of pause. Like, maybe this is a little bit too far, guys. But, you can understand what they were going for. And they had already been doing Superman, so it made sense that maybe they wanted to take Batman in a slightly different direction for an episode by that time and towards the tail end of the new Batman adventures. So again, I could make the case for any episode. I even stick up for ones that people love to crap on. I mean, there's just something about I've got Batman in my basement I've always loved, whether it's the fact that the main children protagonists are at least somewhat reminiscent of Encyclopedia Brown, or maybe that's just me reading into that. It's just a quirky episode, and yes, it makes the Penguin look a bit buffoonish, but it is at least a way to get kids in a participatory status, even though they literally have Batman in their basement. Yes, it's silly as all get out, but I've always loved it from the get-go just because it was that particular blend of Batman into a slightly goofier realm that you could see that story being told in perhaps an even goofier style in, like, say, a 50s Batman comic or a 60s Batman comic. So it has a bit of the charm of the Bronze and Silver Age Batman. So I've never minded that. So I'll even stick up for those or some of the earlier episodes where they were finding their feet a little bit. But to get onto the list, to start at my number 20, and again, I love all these dearly, so this is a very loose ordering, and I have to keep glancing down because I had to write all this out, and then I kept redoing it, and so I'm still just trying to keep on track because again, it's so impossibly difficult to try and just pick your personal favorites. So at number 20, I have episode number 47 of the original run in terms of production number, which is Birds of a Feather. It's my favorite Penguin episode. It was directed by Frank Parr, and the reason why it's my favorite Penguin episode, it gets poor Ozzy into a bit of a romantic struggle because, of course, he's out of prison yet again and gets swept up in the clutches of everybody's least favorite socialite, Veronica Vreeland, who basically parades him around as her new toy. And, of course, Penguin takes her affections as possibly being the real thing. And, of course, complications arise, and all of them are completely earned and deserved due to the underhanded approach of the idle rich. And I've always loved what they did with the Penguin in this particular episode. He has a very human and understandable emotional character arc. And it's also an episode where you have the villain trying to ostensibly go straight, with Batman being, the non-believing presence, keeping an eye on things. And then, of course, things are going to go south, and they go south, and it's quite sad, and it's very touching. So it's definitely my favorite Penguin episode, and I've just always loved what they did with what's seemingly a very simple story, but again, showing the villainy of the idle rich and the socialites of Gotham. So coming up at number 19 is production episode number 41, which is Joker's Wild. This was written, of course, by the great Paul Dini and directed by the great Boyd Kirkland. This is probably my favorite standalone Joker episode. It doesn't get talked about as much, but just the entire setup of a wealthy casino builder deciding as a means to collect insurance in terms of insurance fraud for not doing too well in business, turning his casino into a completely Joker-themed casino, and then instigating the Joker into getting pissed off to destroy said casino, which has his face plastered all over it, which he did not give rights or license or permission to do so. It's just a beautiful idea. It's full of wonderful Joker gags, and of course, Bruce / Batman finds himself in the middle of all this in a mixture of complete and utter disgust at his surroundings, and also there's just the inherent humor and hilarity of Joker getting outclassed and then having to go destroy a casino built entirely in his honor, and then all again being for an insurance fraud scheme. Of course, being a Bond fan, you can't help but get Diamonds Are Forever feels all over the place. There are a number of nods to the film version of Diamonds Are Forever, just as there are many nods to the Bond films all over the series. But it's just a particular story that's always struck a chord with me. And so, again, if I had to pick my favorite standalone Joker episode, there's so many great ones, and they're all pretty much from the brilliant mind of Paul Dini. This one is my particular favorite, just from all the angles, and I love how it sets itself right smack in Las Vegas and plays around with a lot of real world Vegas isms and the building of a casino. And I love the whole idea gag, and so that's why it's my favorite standalone Joker episode. Next up at 18, this is production episode number 66, and that is Sideshow, which is my favorite Killer Croc episode. This was based around an original story that had taken place in the comics beforehand with actually a completely different villain, but it was reworked as a Killer Croc story. It was developed by the great Michael Reeves and then directed by the great Boyd Kirkland again. You're going to hear Kirkland appear a lot in this list, along with Kevin Altieri. They're my two favorite directors of the series, and directed a great number of the best episodes. So of course their names are going to pop up a lot. But anyway, the reason why this has always been a favorite of mine, it is ostensibly an older type of idea where you have the person with a dark past on the lam or on the run or trying to escape said past, or literally trying to escape their prison sentence as Croc breaks out from his captives on or captors, I should say, on a train escorting him from an exchange. He's being monitored by Batman, and of course crashes in the middle of nowhere and then has to hightail it on foot. But this is very much in the tradition of a lot of classic Western ideas, because the figure with the dark past they're trying to escape, Killer Croc, runs into others trying to escape their past, and who are, honest, good people who were just outcasts or never understood. They, of course, in the episode are essentially the former freak show of a circus, and while they have some paraphernalia of their former lives, they have bought a house in the middle of the beautiful country and are just trying to live by themselves, where they can be free to be themselves and not be laughed at. And so the fact that you have Killer Croc wandering into this with his baggage, not just his dark past, but also his baggage from always being considered a freak himself, I think it is a distinct improvement on the original comic story, and it is beautifully designed to get at who Killer Croc is and how he sees reflections of himself in these people, and it tugs at the conscience he didn't know that he had. And of course, Batman trails him to where all of these people are at this house, and then of course Batman arriving on the scene is the match that sparks the fire that was about to burst, in terms of what Killer Croc may or may not do, and how it will most likely shatter the idealism of these people that have been living their nice beatific life, finally achieving some sense of peace. It's just a beautifully written and constructed episode. A good portion of it does take place where you have Batman and Killer Croc going cross terrain and mountain climbing, chasing one another. So there's a good amount where there's actually not a lot of dialogue. And again, it's beautifully directed by Boyd Kirkland. It's wonderfully animated, because it is later on in the series run when they had ironed out a lot of things. And I've just always loved the way that the various plot threads come together and really make the emotional weight of what's going on in terms of Killer Croc's internal battle and his conscience. It really hits home at the end, and it's not done in a hokey way. So it's just another beautifully executed episode of the animated series. Next up at number 17 is, in production order, episode 64, and that is Read My Lips, the first appearance of the ventriloquist and Scarface in the series. The story was by the great Alan Burnett with Michael Reeves again, and directed by the great Boyd Kirkland. The reason why I have this episode up so high is my recent rewatch of the series. I was struck by certain episodes, like this one, where the story may not be as convoluted or as complex as other episodes, but the strength of the episode was also in just how beautifully executed it was. The animation, the boarding, the pacing, the editing, the direction. this is one of the perfect episodes to look at in terms of trying to understand what made Batman the Animated Series so special. Even the creators, when they're doing the various commentaries and things, this was one of the shows they did a commentary on, and the whole time they're just going, we did this because this one turned out so well, and we just love looking at it again. And it really did turn out beautifully, because when you look at the ventriloquist and Scarface, it seems like, how the heck are you going to make these characters work? You have literally a ventriloquist and his dummy. How do you make that menacing or effective in live action? Ventriloquist and Scarface were newer villains at this time. They'd only been invented in the comics a number of years before. The way that they were realized here in the animated series, it feels believable with the right amounts of creepiness and the psychological complexity of the ventriloquist and Scarface, not just simply being multiple personalities, is just really intriguing. It's a movie in and of itself. And again, the way that it's handled here with absolutely brilliant direction makes this one of the most effortless episodes of the entire series. And you go into it thinking, okay, well, they're going to do Scarface, but how can this possibly be, and then right from the get-go, the build up to the reveal of the Scarface dummy is beautifully done. It's one of the most stylish episodes of the series, and again, I think it's one of the best directed shows that is in the entire series. So that's why it's here in my list of the top 20 best episodes. At number 16 is one of the last episodes of the original run. That's episode number 84, which is of course Deep Freeze. It's the return of Mr. Freeze, written by Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, and directed by the great Kevin Altieri. I had to have this one in here. It is the most obvious James Bond-inspired episode in the series. You can make the argument for Lion and the Unicorn a little bit, and there are many Bond allusions and parallels throughout the series, but this one is full-on Batman the Animated Series gets to do their Moonraker episode, except instead of Drax or Stromberg from The Spy Who Loved Me, the villain is a total pastiche knockoff on Walt Disney and his well-publicized interest in cryogenics. And the way that is blended in with the Mr. Freeze character post Heart of Ice, and with the Nora character, and the way all this stuff works out and builds into a end of the world doomsday plot scenario from a master industrialist villain, once again, patterned entirely after Walt Disney. It's just got this wonderful, sick sense of humor. It's a beautiful jumping off point for where Mr. Freeze and Nora goes, again, post Heart of Ice. And again, you get Batman and Robin getting to do a full have to infiltrate the villain's gigantic lair filled with his own private army and his acolytes at the very end, and fight their way through and get to Mr. Freeze and battle their way out. It's beautifully done. I wish this had been one of the feature films they did. It really deserves it. And you can tell everybody was having a ball with this episode. Again, the sort of wonderfully demented sense of humor making a Walt Disney knockoff their villain, the inspired notion of bringing the cryogenics idea in and working that in with Mr. Freeze and giving him somewhere to go, and the guys getting to do their James Bond episode. So you can tell Kevin Altieri had a ball running with this and boarding it to the wazoo. It is jam-packed with action, and it's beautifully done. And again, it's totally them getting to do The Spy Who Loved Me or Moonraker. I mean, it is absolutely without question. So this is one of those episodes that's a must for any James Bond fan. It's Batman getting to do a James Bond-type villain lair final battle, and it's wonderfully done, and a great follow-up sequel to Heart of Ice. So that's why I had to have Deep Freeze in here. And number 15 is another episode from later in the run. This is episode number 76, which is Baby Doll, written by Paul Dini and directed by Dan Reba. This is another one of those episodes that when you come back to it, or even when you see it for the first time, you think, okay, well, where are they going with this? This can't possibly be... This just seems rather silly and straightforward and goofy, and then all the I guess you'd call them trademark emotional Paul Dini gut punches start coming in, and then you're just like, oh, I'm a goner. So this brings the character of Baby Doll into the series, who was created by Paul Dini and first appeared here, and I think she's transitioned over into the comics a few times, but hasn't really been used all that much. But the plot is pretty straightforward, but it is all about the emotional context and the psychological context of what's going on, where you have the former child star retreating into her TV sitcom personality to combat the trauma of living with her growth disorder and being forever stuck looking like a small child, and then kidnapping all the members of her former television family in order to, reenact her only golden years of life. Of course, all based in the world of a TV sitcom. So it's a number of levels of messed up and just beautifully constructed, and it builds to a genuine emotional climax, because you can't have the traditional Batman punch up climax, because of course you would have Batman fighting ostensibly a grown woman, but in the form of a 5-year-old. So it goes into the world of the bizarre a little bit, because she winds up running into a carnival and getting into the Chamber of Horrors and the House of Mirrors and things. And then you have to have Batman figure out how is he going to capture and defeat her, because of course she is, ostensibly, physically like a small child. But it is, again, not about the punch-ups. It's about the emotional weight of what's going on. And the final moments are, for me, I think, just about the best reworking of the famous ending of Lady from Shanghai and the Hall of Mirrors that anybody's ever done, because it's all about the emotional context of what's going on. And, I mean, it's an episode that builds to such points of firstly, at about halfway through the episode, Baby Doll tries to ostensibly commit suicide and kill the entire rest of her TV family, which is, again, pretty dark for a children's cartoon. And then the very end ends with her weeping on Batman's leg. She literally just hugs him and weeps openly and can't do anything else, and Batman has literally nothing he can say. It's an absolutely beautiful episode that really gets to you. It's wonderfully directed, beautifully put together. It's got some great gags, but it's also 20 levels of deliriously messed up and psychologically complex. So it's one of those episodes that every time I rewatch the series, I just go, man, I forgot how amazing this was. So that's why it had to be here in the top 20. At number 14 is episode number 62, which is another of the really great episodes that when you rewatch the series, you're like, damn, I forgot how good this is. And that, of course, is His Silicon Soul, which is technically a follow-up to the great two-parter Heart of Steel, and shows the aftermath of what happens when one of Hardak's duplicates makes its way back to consciousness. And, of course, this was directed again by Boyd Kirkland and written by Marty Eisenberg and Robert Skur, who had done some other episodes for the series. And this is a beautiful continuation of Heart of Steel that really gets into the great notions that permeate a lot of great science fiction, particularly a lot of Isaac Asimov's rules of robotics, and also getting very much into Blade Runner territory once again with does a machine have a soul? Can it ever be considered technically human? Because you have the Hardak duplicate of Batman running around with some idea of Batman and Bruce's idealism, but only the context of what he was given by Hardak. And then in coming back to life, there's beautiful buildup and suspense, because he appears out of nowhere and it seems like it's Batman, but then he just gets shot and literally gets shotgunned to the chest and has wires and things coming out. So it drops you in with an immediate hit of mystery and a total what the heck is going on moment, and builds in its complexity as every animated series episode does. to a climax that is fully about who is Bruce Wayne, who is Batman, what is the nature of Batman, and what is the nature of humanity. And it's also a great sort of punctuation or final grace note on the Great Heart of Steel two-parter. So it's another very weighty episode that you're probably not going to get all the stuff that's going on when you're a kid, because when you're a kid, you're like, oh, wow, it's robot Batman fighting the real Batman who's going to win. But it's got, some nicely creepy bits, and you do have the semi-return of Hardak, which is always great to get the sort of recurring villains to come back, or at least have a tip of the hat to prior episodes to sort of keep that level of continuity going. But again, it's another one of the episodes that the more you think about it, the more just meaty drama is in there, and it's so wonderfully satisfying. It could have easily been a two-parter, as most of the episodes could have been, but it's just beautifully put together, beautifully realized, and that's why it's in the top 20. At number 13 is episode number 70, which is easily the most disturbing episode of the series. If any episode could literally be defined as disturbing, it has to be House and Garden, which is the best standalone Poison Ivy episode, written once again by the great Paul Dini and directed by the great Boyd Kirkland. This is a truly disturbing, haunting episode that has great deals of classic 50s science fiction. There's quite a bit of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but it's also, once again, about the psychology and the emotion of the villain, and it adds a dimension to Poison Ivy that I have never seen in any other context, and makes her far more than the femme fatale, and gets to play around with the great idea of what would Batman do if his villains went straight. So, like with the great Birds of a Feather, seeing the Penguin sort of trying to go straight, House and Garden starts with a mysterious plant-based crime. And so, of course, Batman decides he needs to check up on Poison Ivy. And, of course, she's now apparently married, living in the suburbs, and has adopted children. And Batman and the audience is like, what the hell is going on? But, of course, things are not what they seem, and so Batman and Commissioner Gordon have to go and ask for advice and try to, use a killer to catch a killer. But because things are not what they seem, it's a reveal I don't want to spoil for anyone, because it is beautifully set up, beautifully executed, and truly disturbing in all the best sort of ways. Again, I think this is the best. I haven't read every single comic, but for me, this is the best Poison Ivy story I've seen anybody ever do with the character, because usually she's just the femme fatale, and this gets at the human side behind the posing and the posture, and takes her ecological terrorism to to such an extreme, and her love for plants to such an extreme that it leaves the sheer villainy, and it becomes truly and utterly disturbing, again, in all the best ways. And there's a beautiful coda at the end that just really highlights the emotional weight of what the villain is going through. And it's those grace notes that forever enshrine the animated series in everyone's minds. So it had to be in here. In trying to rank these, this is all very loose, because this episode in particular is the most disturbing, and in some ways the most haunting of the whole show's run. So at number 12, on the complete opposite end of that thematically, we have episode number 81, which is Harley's Holiday, of course written by Paul Dini and directed by Kevin Altieri. This episode is the perfect blending of flat-out comedy, complete zaniness, but also getting to see Harley Quinn on her own, struggling to survive, and also at very first, the whole setup of the whole gag of the episode is she gets her her sanity confirmed, right down to actually getting the form that she gets to hold up to everybody that just says has sane stamped on it, which is hysterical. And of course, as soon as she gets back out in the real world and tries to go straight, it all goes horribly wrong after a misunderstanding after about 2 seconds. But of course, when you go around, on roller skates, blowing bubble gum with your pet hyenas down the main street of Gotham, and you decide to go shopping, you're not probably in the right or any sort of mindset to do anything so-called normal. And of course, in 2 seconds, she's back to being full on Harley and against the world because the world is turned against her just because she tried to go straight and she just tried to buy some clothes, and they just wouldn't let her, and it just goes into crazy town from there. And by the end of the episode, you have a full-on it's a mad, 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 mad world type scenario going on where everything is converging on Harley and Veronica Vreeland, who gets drawn into the whole mess. Everything just converges into a point and just implodes. But because it was written by Paul Dini, it has the beautiful payoff at the very end, where of course Batman brings Harley back to Arkham, as is of course bound to happen. But I won't spoil it for those who haven't seen the episode, but it's a beautiful emotional payoff that is really unexpected after the great hijinks and fun that have preceded it, and it perfectly completes the arc that Harley was on in this 22-minute episode. That just cements it as one of the greats. It is wacky and fun, but also grounded. And again, that ending is beautiful, and it has a great gag and payoff that leaves other characters speechless. So even though it's beautifully emotional, it's got that wonderful sort of Paul Dini last little, just wonderful mix of hilarity and genuine pathos and emotion. So it's one of the two Harley standalones that are in this list, and I think it's a beautiful way to utilize the character. At number 11, I have episode number 35, which is Night of the Ninja, written by Steve Perry and directed by Kevin Altieri. This is the first appearance of Kyodai Ken and the first major delving into Bruce's back history and what would have taken place during his travel around the world gathering information as a young man in order to be Batman. And I've always been fascinated with the character of Kyodai Ken. I think it's a shame that he hasn't really made any other major appearances that I'm aware of. And I love the idea of Bruce encountering someone and essentially making his first great rival, who becomes a recurring villain later in his life as Batman. But all this stuff starting in the past, and of course it all taking place while Bruce was in Japan learning martial arts. And you have ties to codes of honor and how Kyodai Ken rejects all of this and becomes the ninja and is out for himself. And of course, just so happens to come to Gotham and is targeting Wayne Industries. So it's wonderfully all tied together. And then you get the fun bits of, Bruce Wayne having to interact with Kyodai Ken all these years later, and their rivalry is just right there, boiling under the surface. But of course, Bruce can't fight back. He can't reveal his talents. So, of course, that leaves Kyodai Ken to think, that you have gone soft, Wayne. And, of course, it further humiliates Bruce. And Bruce has to figure out how can I do this in front of other people and not show that I'm actually Batman? And how can Batman do things and not reveal that he's actually Bruce Wayne? So there's some interesting psychology going on. And it's also interesting to see how Robin is utilized, because Batman always keeps him at a certain arm's length, and Robin doesn't have, or I should say Dick Grayson doesn't have the full context throughout the episode of all this bad blood and all this back history that Bruce has with this strange ninja character. So, and it's also beautifully directed by Kevin Altieri. It's got a great sense of movement and pacing, and it's just absolutely effortless. So it had to be in here. So next is one of the two-parters, and I grouped the two-parters together. So they're of course technically two different episodes. I will say that as with most two-parters, usually if you look at both episodes very critically, there's usually one episode that's a little stronger than the other because the way the story is distributed, or sometimes it's a lot of the setup and exposition is all in part one, and then part two can kind of fall off. But with this one, both episodes are extraordinarily strong, so I just grouped them together. So, of course, at number 10, I have Feet of Clay parts 1 and 2. Part 1 was directed by Dick Sebast, and part 2 was directed by Kevin Altieri. The story was by Marv Wolfman along with Michael Reeves, and is a complete reinvention and distillation of all the various clay faces that had existed in the comics. There were several going back to the original Basil Carlo Golden Age horror actor turned clayface, but without any shape-shifting powers or anything, down to the eventual shape-shifting clay faces. And then there have been other clay faces since this version, but this version just wonderfully distilled all of that comic back history and injected it into a beautifully realized version that is very much rooted in the original actor Basil Carlo version of the first Clayface. And it's also fun because for a film buff, you can see all the parallels to real world personalities. So the idea that you have the great lead actor disfigured in an accident. You think about the sort of parallels to Monty Clift or other actors, and then the desperation that eventually leads him to Roland Daggett. So you're working into the crime boss and greedy industrialists who are the real underbelly and the lords of crime in Gotham. So it's always great how the animated series would tie into, say, your Rupert Thornes or your Roland Daggett. So it's also got the full-on horror film vibes due to how Matt Hagen is transformed into Clayface. It's one of those bits you see of the series as a kid, and it just sticks with you when he is inundated with the shall we say, the product that should have never gone to market and thankfully didn't. It's a full-on horror film, and then of course as Clayface discovers his newfound powers throughout the two parts, it becomes even more chilling what he can do with them, and then how Batman will then grapple with this new enemy who has abilities that he's never before had to face. And it's also a show that throughout the two parts doesn't have any segments that really let up, and has a lot of great side characters and little bits. A great moment in particular is when you have the side henchman of Germs, who's named that because he's terrified of germs, gets interrogated by Batman in a closet of a hospital, and is thrown underneath a shelf full of various live and active cultures and germs, and is terrified more of the germs than the Dark Knight about to interrogate him. So it's a show that is all full of moments like that, but it's also incredibly animated, and most of all in the finale of part 2, where in the control room Batman confronts Hagen with all of his great past performances, and Clayface goes through the just unbelievable animation in the sequence where at the very end he is just uncontrollably going through all of his past lives and past guises. It's one of the great standout moments for the series without question, and it's just an incredible two-parter that for me is the definitive Clayface. I don't need any other version, because this takes all the best elements from the previous versions in the comics and the different iterations, and adds the right tragic notes with the right horror film notes, but creates just a seemingly unstoppable villain that has some amount of pathos, and would appear a few more times in the series, and was always used incredibly well. Next at number 9 is episodes 10 and 11, which of course is the Two-Face parts 1 and 2 two-parter, written by Alan Burnett with Randy Rogel and directed by Kevin Altieri. This once again is a complete reinvention of a classic Batman rogues gallery member, just like with Clayface, where all the various iterations of Two-Face were sort of, condensed down together and reworked with new ideas into the animated series version of Two-Face, which is quite possibly definitive. And the real departure, the real changeover in terms of the character makeup really comes from the mind of Alan Burnett, who seems to have a knack for this sort of thing, and his idea of planting the idea that you essentially have Harvey Dent before becoming Two-Face already was having psychological issues with another personality and having to deal with his rage and anger issues with that alternate personality. That adds such a new dimension to the Two-Face character and the ultimate tragedy that befalls Harvey Dent that it's just again, I think it's the best Two-Face anybody's ever done, and weaving in the political corruption of Gotham and Harvey running for mayor, and then of course weaving in Rupert Thorne and his political machinations and trying to get his fingers on Harvey Dent as well. It's beautifully constructed and set up. In terms of the two-parter, I do think part two doesn't have as much of the meaty stuff, but part two is really more about the aftermath of part one and Harvey Dent's tragic fall and becoming Two-Face, and also having the relationship with the Grace character and how she is essentially the one last physical manifestation of his former life, and how that haunts him, and how the Harvey portion of Two-Face still has some forlorn hope that maybe he can have some sort of life. Of course, wouldn't be the same as what it would have been before, but it's a beautifully realized, wonderfully tragic two-parter that again encapsulates everything there is to love about the Two-Face character, and and does so perfectly that I don't think anyone has ever done it as well, and it is for me still the definitive iteration of the Two-Face character. At number 8 is a fan favorite, and one of those you just knew had to be on any list of the top 20 episodes. That's episode number 46, which is of course Almost Got Him, directed by co-producer Eric Radomski, and of course from the mind of Paul Dini. Just the idea of some of Batman's greatest foes getting around a card table for a friendly, not so friendly game of poker is just too beautiful to resist. And it gets to show off various animation styles where all of the various foes get to tell how they themselves, at one point or another in their various ways, almost killed Batman, so they almost got him. And it's full of wonderful puns and gags and great villain moments. It even explains in this animated mythos where the giant penny in the Batcave comes from. Poison Ivy gets her great turn in a pumpkin patch, of course, and we get the immortal line as uttered by Killer Croc, really, really playing to Croc's strings, where, of course, he gets to tell his story. And, it isn't as flamboyant, shall we say, as some of the other folks, but, he really tried. I threw a rock at him. It was a big rock. But as beautiful as that sounds of Joker, Two-Face, Penguin, Poison Ivy, and Killer Croc in some criminal's haven, getting to have a friendly game of poker while they swap war stories, it wouldn't be, a great episode if it was just that. There is another story element going on, and once the game sequence ends, we get the nice little coda at the end, and the way that Batman is talked about, and the way that he's hinted at but not seen throughout the episode, but his mere presence being there, it does have, being a Shadow fan, it does have some elements that feel very Shadow-esque, particularly in the great reveal of the episode. But it's wonderfully done, beautifully executed, a fan favorite for good reasons. So, of course, Almost Got Him is at number 8. At number 7 is episode number 72, and by far my favorite Harley Quinn standalone story. That's, of course, Harlequinade, directed by Kevin Altieri, written, of course, by Harley's creator, Paul Dini. This episode starts out being, Joker essentially gets an atomic warhead and then holds the city for ransom. And poor Harley is left to be thrown into Arkham. And of course, it then turns into what is ostensibly Batman gets Harley Quinn out, and we have 48 Hours 3 with Batman and Harley Quinn. Where Batman is using Harley to try and get to the Joker before, of course, Joker, could possibly detonate an atomic bomb over Gotham. So again, beautifully high stakes for a children's cartoon. You don't have to, dumb things down for kids. Sometimes if you go for higher stakes, you go for, full on dramatic, whoa, it's great. It just adds to the drama of the thing going on. But this allows for beautiful comedic moments between the extremely stoic Dark Knight and Harley. Even something as simple as you put a bunch of switches in the Batmobile in front of Harley in the passenger seat. Of course, she's going to press all of them. And of course, what happens? But it's not all just beautiful little goofy bits of comedy. There is a very pressing thing going on with stakes that are unimaginable. And of course, if Joker is pushed to detonate said warhead, of course he's going to. But it also allows for greater probing of the dynamic and the relationship of the Joker and Harley Quinn. And this was still, while their relationship hadn't quite been fully defined, because this is still technically before the Mad Love story was created, and first in comic form and then later as a new Batman Adventures episode. But for me, while you need the background of the Mad Love story, this particular story in Harlequinade, this particular moment, I think it shows the dynamics of their relationship to an even greater degree, because there are moments where they cross each other, and by the end you have the great gag where Batman and Robin have to use this element to try and convince Harley that maybe Joker isn't her as beloved her puddin as she thinks or she wants to believe. And so she for a portion of the climax is literally trying to kill him. It builds to a wonderful reconciliation between the pair that perfectly encapsulates their totally demented, seemingly somewhat one-sided love affair that is full of pain and torment and ultimately sadness that neither Batman or Robin can ever even begin to comprehend. All they can do is pretty much shrug their shoulders. But again, what really makes this is the fact that you have the comedy woven into stakes of the highest magnitude. It's not just, oh, we have to go stop the Joker because he's gonna, gas something, or no, he's literally got an atomic bomb. So no punches are pulled. And so for me, this is my favorite Harley story and my favorite standalone Harley story, not just for the fact that it's essentially Batman Harley 48 hours. So of course, had to put Harlequinade very high up in this list. At number 6 is another of the all-important two-parters of the series, and that's Robin's Reckoning, Parts 1 and 2, directed by Dick Seabest, written by Randy Rogel. This gives the background and how Dick Grayson became Robin in the animated series universe, and it perfectly retells the absolute golden age origin of Robin, with a few little spins to get it into a more modern context and to fit it within the animated series world. But it's in particular part 1 in the dealing with the grieving young Dick Grayson and how the deaths of the Graysons are handled, and how young Dick is brought into Wayne Manor, and how it takes some time for he and Bruce to find some common footing, and how Batman is so focused on finding the killer of the Graysons that it's Alfred who has to remind him that there's a grieving young boy upstairs who is completely alone, and Bruce cannot help but be confronted by the living parallel of what he went through. So it's beautifully realized, but told in flashback when the same individual behind the death of the Graysons resurfaces in the current day. And of course, the tension that already exists between Batman and Robin is cranked up to an even greater degree because Batman is trying to keep Robin once again at arm's length and not trusting him as fully as he maybe should due to his own emotional hangups, guilt, and concerns. So it's all character drama, and it's all richly earned. But this is one of those where I do feel that part one is the stronger of the two. Part two does have a nice payoff, but I just don't think it's as effective as part one. But part one is so effective that it did win one of the series Emmys. So this is an Emmy-winning episode with good reason. It has a great emotional weight to it, and it's really I think it is the best live action Robin origin there is. And it's not like there's a lot of Robin origins because they always try to keep Robin out of the films because they're always like, no, he's too goofy, we don't want the boy wonder, we must have Batman brooding and dark. But Robin is an important part of the Batman mythos, and it's not like he had a happy childhood. So Robin is gritty and dark too. This is just a perfect retelling of the Robin origin story, completely recreating the Golden Age origin, and just beautifully executed. So that's why it's so high up in this list. And again, particularly part one, still it just works on every single level. Now we come to my personal top 5 favorite episodes of Batman the Animated Series. And to this point, I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to try and rank my favorite episodes because, again, I think every episode of the series is great. I think even some of the underrated ones are truly great because of how well executed they are in both the writing and the direction, and of course the music spotting and the scoring and everything across the board. There is no bad episode of the animated series, but coming to the top 5, I found it pretty easy. So my top 5 are pretty much set in stone. I think the order is pretty much how I would do them. So this is not just personal preference, but how much they resonated with me over the years and how well executed they are in terms of storytelling and overall impact. So for me, these are the 5 best episodes of Batman the Animated Series, and it's pretty much set in stone. So starting with number 5, this is, I think, the best two-parter in the series, and I think it's truly underrated. That is episodes number 38 and 39, Heart of Steel, parts 1 and 2, written by Bryn Stevens and directed by Kevin Altieri, who just has a field day. So Heart of Steel has the villain of the supercomputer Hardak, who, of course, has very HAL 9000 overtones, and there's a lot of Blade Runner in this film, but a lot of also 50 science fiction with robot duplicates and not being able to tell who is the original and who may be a duplicate of Hardak. And the stakes start small and with an element of mystery because you have the briefcase that turns into a spider robot that is working its way through Wayne Enterprises while Batman tries to intercept it, and it's seemingly unstoppable and you don't know what its purpose is. And this draws the viewer in. It's brilliantly staged and executed, and again keeps the air of mystery that furthers and furthers and furthers. There's also the great choice to have the creator of Hardak be voiced by the actor William Sanderson, who of course was probably most famous for playing Sebastian in Blade Runner. So it wears its Blade Runner influence right on its sleeve. But what always amazes me with this two-parter is you have a great villain that is working with elements that are ripped straight out of pulpy stories and science fiction and wearing its influences on its sleeve. And that would be enough because you build to the climax of part 1 where Batman's identity is discovered because you have a duplicate walking into the Batcave, and then Batman being almost torn apart by his own Batcave that's been taken over by Hardak as the cliffhanger of part 1. I mean, that's that's top end high stakes right there. But in addition to all this going on, they work in the inclusion of Barbara Gordon and start setting her on the path of eventually becoming Batgirl. So essentially, this is also serving as the Barbara Gordon origin story in the series. She had been maybe alluded to a teensy a little bit before this, but this is really where she comes in for the first time and manages, in trying to save her father, Jim Gordon, winds up working with Batman, and through her own plucky heroism starts displaying a lot of what Babs would do, and a lot of Batgirl isms, and she's not even making a costume or anything. So this is already showing the elements of her character that totally will lead her to becoming Batgirl. So this is not only a great two-parter with a lot of fun with robot duplicates and Batman fighting a supercomputer and having to deal with duplicates of himself eventually, but also Gordon and everyone, and trying to escape being captured to be turned into a duplicate himself. And you have robots peeling their faces off and showing Terminator-like endoskeletons. There's a lot of Terminator DNA in this too. But it's also the Barbara Gordon origin episode. It is so beautifully constructed that it's serving multiple purposes at the same time, and all in two episodes. This could have been a three-part episode because there's so much story going on that this is kind of why we got his Silicon Soul later, because in the two parts it does sort of allude to, you would think, why wouldn't Hardak make a Batman duplicate? And of course he did. It's just they literally couldn't fit it in anywhere, so they had to take it out. And of course that idea was left sitting around, and eventually we got the great His Silicon Soul spinoff, which I much prefer doing it that way because it allows that story to grow much more organically and essentially form a coda to this great two-parter. So the phrase all killer, no filler applies here. This is, without a doubt, I think, the best two-parter episode in the series. It is jam-packed with fantastic moments. It's brilliantly directed by Kevin Altieri all the way through, and he just has a field day. I mean, again, you have duplicate robots peeling their faces off, doing spider walks down walls. You have Batman actually getting to kill things because they're robots. So you can pull their arms off, you can blow them up, you can rip their heads off because they're robots. They're not real people. So standards and practices don't care that you're committing violence against robots. So again, everybody has a field day. It's one of the best episodes of the series, and I think the best two-parter. And it does all this introducing a great new villain, wearing its inspirations on its sleeve, and grinning all the way through. And it also serves as the Barbara Gordon origin, and she's just incredibly well woven in. It never sticks out, never feels out of place, never feels like they're shoving this in there because, oh, we got to have Babs in somewhere. Oh, we'll just put her in this two-parter, and then we don't have to worry about doing an origin. She's perfectly woven into the story, so that's why it's my number 5. I think it is, again, the best two-parter episode in the series. At number 4 is episode number 44. You probably knew it had to be on here since I already talked about Night of the Ninja. It's, of course, Day of the Samurai. Again, written by Steve Perry, this time directed by Bruce Timm. This one I have always adored. This one goes fully into Bruce going back into his past. We have more of the flashback scenes. He has to confront Kyodai Ken once again. And I always love when Batman has the globetrotting aspect. This is the type of stuff that Denny O'Neil would put in all the time. The idea of Batman or Bruce Wayne getting on a plane and having to go to another far-off country. So you have Batman overseas. So he has to go back to Japan because Kyodai Ken is after the death touch and kidnaps a member of the dojo where they had originally trained. And Bruce has to talk to his original sensei, and they have to do the whole thing where they're talking around the fact that they both know that each other knows Bruce Wayne's secret, but they're talking around as if Batman is another person. I always love those type of scenarios where you have people who have mutual respect for one another but won't say things in the open. But there's a lot of old wounds and a lot of back history once again, and it builds off of Night of the Ninja. So this is another great moment where you have another episode way later in the run that's calling back to a previous episode and is, very much a sequel to it and continuing that notion of continuity and that flow. So it's very rewarding that you're getting this because you've already invested in the previous episode. And again, it's Bruce and Alfred going to Japan and Batman having to fight Kyodai-ken once more, and then having to figure out how to combat the deadly one death touch. And the final battle takes place on a erupting volcano. I mean, what's not to love? It's just a beautiful image of Batman. And then, because of course Kyodai-ken knows Bruce is Batman by reading his fighting style and knowing Bruce Wayne, so you get that great psychological understanding the villain has for the hero character, and all going back to their past together. It's beautifully put together. It is not necessarily the greatest animated episode because the show did have to use different studios. There are some episodes like this one where the animation, there are more moments where some characters are off model or where things aren't as pristine as they could be, but I think that adds to some of the charm and some of the liveliness of some of the episodes. So that's never detracted from this particular one for me, because it makes it feel a little bit more alive. And the fact that we have the continual flashbacks that usually have a sepia tone grading to them, it adds to that otherworldly feeling. And of course, this is, again, Batman in Japan. And the final act is Batman unmasking and Bruce fighting Kyodai-ken on an erupting volcano with Alfred tied up, helpless, having to watch as the lava flow starts to come down, threatening to kill the both of them. It's a beautifully written and constructed episode. It's the perfect follow-up to Night of the Ninja, and I just think it's a shame that Kyodai-ken never came back. I think there's such great dramatic potential with this character being from Bruce's history and his past, and of course knowing that Bruce and Batman are one and the same. So it had to be here. It is always been one of my favorite episodes, and I just love everything about it. I love the story context. I've always loved the idea of stories dealing with the foreigner going to Japan and having to be the complete outsider, and I really enjoy stories where Bruce is dealing with things from his past before he became Batman. Number 3 is a must. It is episode 30, which is Perchance To Dream. This is, for me, the best of a particular villain, but when you know who the villain is, it does sort of give away what the actual plot twist that comes at the end of the episode. But obviously, if you've gotten this far in this video, you've seen all of the series multiple times. So for me, this is the great Mad Hatter episode. This is the episode that most deeply goes into Bruce's character. The idea of Batman being knocked out and waking up, and Bruce finding that he has the perfect life and his parents are alive and he isn't Batman. It's just a striking concept that would draw anybody in. And this idea was developed by Alan Burnett, who once again came up with one of his amazing ideas. So it was Lauren Bright, Michael Reeves, and Joe Lansdale who wound up developing it, and then Lansdale wrote the final teleplay of the idea that Burnett came up with. But it's just an episode that, there's not a lot of action. Batman does not appear in most of it, of course, outside of the bookends, but it's all about Bruce's character. It's all about his psychological traumas, his own guilt, his own fears, and his own desires. This is the type of wonderful stuff that is very similar to the great character turmoil that makes Mask of the Phantasm the best Batman film ever made, which again stems from an Alan Burnett story concept and ideas. So again, the man has a knack for coming up with brilliant story concepts for The Dark Knight. And this one is the most personal episode of the series, I think, in terms of it really gets into Bruce's turmoil and the things he grapples with on a daily basis, both in his Bruce Wayne life and in his Batman life. And it's the fact that all this is laid so bare that when it's revealed that the Mad Hatter is behind all of this, it's such an invasion of privacy because it is Bruce's own psychosis laid bare before him, and he has to have his face just rubbed in it and just ground into it because he has finally started to sort of buy into what's surrounding him, and that maybe he is crazy, maybe it's all been a nightmare, but there's a part of him that can't buy into it. He cannot allow himself to just go with the flow and perhaps be happy, because it's that part of him that keeps him sane. It's that part of him that forever remains the detective, and it is what the Mad Hatter ultimately cannot believe, that somebody could reject his great heaven-like scenario that he developed. And of course, you think that the Mad Hatter obviously must know who Batman is now, because he's tied him up somewhere and he's done this. But the other conceit I really love is the fact that the Mad Hatter doesn't really care who Batman is, and he just wants to be rid of him. And now he's sad because his greatest creation to make a person happy has been destroyed and rejected. And so now he's going to go back to Arkham, and he's all poor and sad Mad Hatter once more, but his greatest work's been rejected. And Batman has to contain his rage of just how his emotions have been laid so utterly bare before him. And then the weight of dealing with that and having that experience and then being dropped back into the real world once more. All the pain and all of the suffering just comes rushing back in a torrent once more. It would be overwhelming for anyone, but of course, Batman himself must continue. There is nothing else but the endless crusade against crime and villainy. Again, it's, I think, the most personal episode in terms of Bruce's emotions and his own psychological state. So all the villains of the series get their great psychological analysis in an episode. Well, this is the episode where Bruce Wayne gets his great psychological deconstruction and analysis. So we come to my top 2 favorite episodes, and of course, most people always have a particular special episode as their number 1, which is totally understandable, but I will break precedent and tradition because it is not my number 1. So my number 2 episode is episode number 14, Heart of Ice, written by Paul Dini, directed by Bruce Timm. This is the episode that made people sit up and take notice. This is the episode that reinvented Mr. Freeze, created the tragic backstory with Nora Freeze. This is the show that won the series its first Emmy. This is the episode that crystallized everything the animated series was trying to do. This was the episode that really made, again, everybody sit up and take notice. This was the episode where everything came together. So the previous 13 episodes, while I think they're all great, they were of varying quality because they were the first 13 episodes. They were trying different things. They were having to work with different animation studios. They had, some of the earlier episodes were from writers who were there before Alan Burnett came on, and so maybe the scripts were not as finely analyzed and broken down and reworked and finalized as much as they would have been had they been produced later on. So with any show, you're going to have the time period of getting your feet on the ground and getting things going. And you have that moment where everything comes together, and that's Heart of Ice. And it packs such a genuine emotional punch that for me, there are moments that get to you emotionally throughout the series. Not just, oh, that was great episodes, but moments of genuine pathos and genuine emotion where the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, or, grown men cry. This is one of those where you definitely do. And Paul Dini knows how to push those buttons unlike any other Batman writer, I think. And he has translated his talents into writing great Batman comics as well. But Heart of Ice reinvented Mr. Freeze and made him into the great tragic villain, whereas before he had just been the guy with the cold ray and had 3 different performers do very goofy version of him in the Batman 66 series, and he had just been sort of a throwaway villain. So it's iconic. It's a perfect 22-minute miniature movie, beautifully realized by co-producer Bruce Timm. It's just one of the great Batman experiences. It just is. So it makes sense why it's the most famous episode of the series and why most people have it as their number one favorite or the best episode of the series. It is, for me, one of the two episodes that truly get to you on an emotional level, or at least for me. But you hear everybody talk about crying at the end of Heart of Ice, so you just do. it's that perfectly executed, and the arc of Mr. Freeze is so wonderfully built, crafted, and paced over the 22 minutes. Even the way that he's defeated by Batman, and how Batman has to come to grips with how to defeat an ice villain, and also figure out Mr. Freeze's backstory, and that he's technically not an out-and-out villain. He's the tragic villain, and who is the real villain of the piece. There's so many layers. There's so many fascinating elements that it seems so much longer and so much grander than its 22-minute single episode runtime. And again, it is a truly emotional experience for those who haven't seen it. This is one of those things you even start to think of it. You start to think of the lines, you start to think of the dialogue, and you'll start tearing up. You think of the end sequence of Mr. Freeze locked away in Arkham Asylum for the first time, and the light snow starts to fall, and you're just a goner. But that's why it is the iconic episode of the series. Again, it's where everything came together. And as I said, for most people, it is their number one episode. But there's one episode that just outstrips it a little bit for me, and that is, of course, my number one episode. That reaches me on not just the level of Batman fandom and great storytelling, but it hits on such a personal level as well. So my number one absolute best episode of Batman the Animated Series is episode number 18, Beware the Gray Ghost. Directed by Boyd Kirkland, story by Dennis O'Flaherty and Tom Ruegger, teleplay by Garen Wolfe and Tom Ruegger. This episode is so incredibly special, and is another that definitely has not the greatest animation in the world. There's one particular moment where the Batmobile makes a turn and it looks sort of rubbery, and in the commentary they all start putting their face in their hands like, oh no, it's a rubbery Batmobile. But that doesn't detract from it at all. This episode works on so many different levels, because you have the story of essentially why Bruce got the idea to become Batman in the first place, because he was so inspired by his childhood hero, the Gray Ghost. The parallels there with original Golden Age origin of Batman that Bill Finger developed. You have Bruce being inspired by Zorro, the Avenger, the essentially really the original masked Avenger, along with the Scarlet Pimpernel and the other sort of progenitors of what eventually became the idea of the superhero. But Zorro really started the entire idea of a superhero film, with Douglas Fairbanks making the character world famous with The Mark of Zorro in 1920, a year after Zorro debuted in 1919 in Curse of Capistrano. But this works on an additional level from that, because it's not just, we licensed Zorro and we have Bruce watching Zorro. They take that and they parallel the real inspiration behind Batman and every modern superhero, because the Gray Ghost is patterned in terms of his costume and his look and just the style of the program. He's very Shadow-esque, right down to the cape and the flowing slouch hat and using the darkness. And the fact that Bruce is watching an old television show, as a kid, and he has his slouch hat and his cape, it seems very much inspired by kids who grew up sitting around and vividly listening to the Shadow on radio with their parents, because the Shadow radio program was, one of the most famous and beloved radio shows of the golden age of radio. So there's a lot of the Shadow in the Gray Ghost, and that's sort of the team giving their nod to the true inspiration behind Batman, because Batman started out as one of the many Shadow clones, which was a whole cottage industry, first in the pulp magazines and then in comic books. And of course, the first Batman story in Detective 27, Case of the Chemical Syndicate, was an actual literal ripoff of a Theodore Tinsley written Shadow pulp story. So I mean, you read the early days of Batman, and I mean, it very much starts out as a Shadow clone, with some elements of the radio version of the Shadow, in addition to the pulp Shadow. But if that would be enough to make it a great episode, but no, they went the further level of actually casting Adam West as the Grey Ghost character and the real life actor who played him, and then worked in the real life parallel of the actor being washed up and not being wanted because he was so stereotyped as the Grey Ghost, which was now a character that everybody sort of forgot about. So getting into the genuine pain and pathos of going through that, and having Adam West sort of voicing some of the demons that he lives through post Batman 66 and the decades of not being able to get work because he was so typecast as Batman, and the series was over and no one was going to do anything Batman wise. And then even mentioning Batman 66 was a no-no because everything had to be, especially post Dark Knight Returns, it had to be gritty and dark and realistic, and the last thing anybody wanted to do was acknowledge the Batman 66 series. So it's just a beautiful tip of the hat to so many parts of Batman lore and so many elements and things that inspired the Dark Knight that never get their true credit. And all of this in a wonderfully realized story that gives you perfect flashbacks to Bruce's childhood and how he would interact with his parents before the tragedy that befell the Waynes, and getting to see that childlike admiration and love of adventure fiction and adventure shows and adventure plays, which is why we come to Batman anyway. So it's really a love letter to fiction in general, to adventure stories. It's about the love of adventure stories and how that enriches everyone's lives. It's about the love of Batman as a character. It's about loving comic books or radio plays or dramas or films or television shows, and embracing that. It's not the nostalgia of youth necessarily, but it's that unabashed childlike sense of wonder that is so hard to recapture. And it also gets to the heart of why Bruce does what he does. This was his inspiration. And you get the beautiful conceit of something has come out and is so reminiscent of something, and Bruce can't put his finger on it, but some new villain is on the scene and things are occurring that are very strange, but it seems to ring certain bells in Batman's mind. And then drawing further going through the clues and the evidence, and realizing that someone is reenacting an episode of the Grey Ghost in real life all these decades later. And of course, the show is long out of print. That's another nod to Batman 66, which, didn't get a release until the Blu-ray set, which was just unbelievable that ever happened due to the legal hurdles and the show being stuck in rights hell for decades. But it's just a beautiful sense of interacting with the past, both in terms of the old Grey Ghost show coming to life all these years later, seemingly, but also of interacting with the past of Bruce Wayne pre the death of the Waynes, and Bruce as a child, and how that has stayed with him all these years, and him essentially getting to sort of pay tribute to the person who inspired him, even though it was essentially the idea of the Grey Ghost and not necessarily the washed up actor playing him. And the final conclusion is so wonderfully emotionally drawn, again with real world parallels, because it's getting the original show reissued, and just again very much like what would eventually happen with Batman 66 all the years later. And it's also interesting and very touching to see how you get little bits of the animators themselves in, because of course Bruce Timm himself not only voices but actually is one of the main characters of the show. And if you know any of the guys, you'll know that immediately if you're a big of a fan as I am, and you pretty much obsess over all of the extras and interviews and panels that they still do. It's always great when they would pop up in the show, but this one in particular, the fact that it's actually Bruce Timm as a main character and it's actually drawn to look just like him, I always really enjoyed that, and the fact that they would do all this and acknowledge Batman 66 when Bruce Timm and others were desperately trying not to do the Batman 66 style. They were trying to do their own thing and stay away from Biff, Pam, Pow, Zowie, but that they would acknowledge it in this way and actually bring in Adam West just added such an additional layer of displaying their intensive love of the entirety of the Batman history, the Batman mythos. And it's only once I've gotten older and the more I would rewatch the series that this episode just hit home even further. It's not just a great Batman story because you get the flashbacks. It's not just a great nod to Batman 66 by bringing in Adam West and talking about the show being out of print. It's not just a nod to pulp stories of the 1930s that inspired Batman. It's not just a nod to Zorro. It's not just a nod to the Shadow. It's all about the love of adventure fiction and how that enriches everyone's lives. And it's about the love of Batman as a character and what these stories are supposed to mean. So that for me is why it hits on such an emotional level, because it's again about trying to maintain and rediscover that childlike sense of wonder, which is the whole reason why we come back to stories. It's about the power of storytelling, and what could be more dramatic than that. It's about the need in life for storytelling. So that is why it has eclipsed Heart of Ice for me. It hits on so many different levels, and it is beautifully directed by Boyd Kirkland. Particularly, there's all the great transitions between Bruce in the present and going back to memories as a child. It's beautifully put together, even if the animation isn't always the greatest in places. And that, again, kind of makes me love it a little bit more because it isn't perfect. It has those intrinsic flaws that make it feel like it's living and breathing as it plays out its 22-minute runtime. So that is why it has become my absolute favorite and top Batman the Animated Series episode. So that's my top 20 BTAS episodes. This has went longer than I anticipated, but it took me a long time to narrow it down to 20. So again, as I said, if you ask me tomorrow, I'd probably have a totally different list. But this is just a sort of loose ranking. I love all the episodes to death. They are all great. They all have their fans. There is not a bad episode in BTAS. And if you've never taken the plunge and seen Batman the Animated Series, what on earth are you waiting for? It is still the definitive adaptation of The Dark Knight Detective. It is the truest representation of the Batman mythos, and it is really unequaled by anything, any adaptation of any comic book character. So that's why I wanted to do this as part of my continuing video series on Batman the Animated Series hitting the 30th anniversary milestone. And again, this is just my own personal favorite top 20 episodes. So everybody's going to have a different one. I would love to hear down in the comments what your own favorite episodes are, or your own interactions with various episodes, or episodes you kind of came around on for maybe you didn't like them as a kid and you came around on them years later as an adult. So as always, I'd love to hear and have further Batman discussions with you guys. So with that, I just want to say, if it's been a while since you've looked at the animated series, go look at it again. And again, if you've never taken the plunge, if you've never seen the show, now is the perfect time. It's immortal and timeless, and it's a show that really needs to be re-experienced every year or two. Just go through the whole run, and it is absolute magic, and it is a rediscovery of why you love the character of Batman and the world of the Bat mythos. So this has been my top 20 BTAS episodes, and I want to thank you ever so much for watching.
It was a really big rock. Nobody ever believes me. It was a really, really big rock. Bet none of you guys ever threw a big rock at him. Should have thrown a big rock at you guys.